Okay, it is, well, look at this. Nathaniel has drawn a crowd. It's a pleasure being old, which I am, and being able to introduce Nathaniel Daw. I'll say some specifics on him, and then I'll say my own personal swing on it. He took his undergraduate degree at Columbia, Summa, in, 1996, maybe. And then went on to Carnegie Mellon and got a master's degree and a Ph.D. With David Turecki, where he wrote what I think is an epic thesis, and I'm going to return to that in a bit. Did a postdoc at UCL with Peter Dayan and others. You're kind of spread out when you're there. Returned to NYU, started rising through the ranks, and then has been at Princeton for some number of years, where he's a full professor. He's an endowed professor. Nathaniel wrote a thesis around, for some reason I got hold of it in like 1999 or 2000 or something, but I think you officially graduated in 2003, which in the history of reinforcement learning is really quite important. So the godfather of reinforcement learning in the modern age here is a 1984 thesis by Richard Sutton, who with Andy Bartow won the Turing Prize last year, a well-deserved victory, as it were, where he invented this idea of temporal difference learning, which when you look at it is innocuous and simple and whatnot. And when you think about it and study it in different contexts, it's notoriously deep in a way, and has been connected to all kinds of biological systems that do reinforcement learning. That's 1984. The next epic thesis was Christopher Watkins in 1989 at Cambridge, where he fused what you would call TD learning with dynamic programming invented by Richard Bellman in the early 50s, and produced Q learning, which is a way to assign value to state action pairs, and really it is an incremental way of doing dynamic programming. These are the very, very early days. And then another decade later, Nathaniel came along, and that work was with Watkins was kind of turbocharged by writing papers with Peter Dayan, where they proved it would converge to things that ought to. But Nathaniel wrote a thesis around 2000, maybe 12 or 13 years later, which I have read. Was I an examiner on that or something? I have a copy of your thesis. But here's the thing about his thesis. He hasn't published everything from it yet. It is chock full of nuggets, which are fantastically brilliant ideas, most of which he's already gotten credit for, some of which other people have claimed credit for. Not sure how that happened. Anyway, and I dug it up last night and was sort of rummaging through it, and so it's a great pleasure to do that. So I consider him a pioneer in both the empirical side of taking reinforcement learning and connecting it to real world data, two kinds, behavioral data and neurophysiological data. He's exactly the kind of theoretician that takes all that stuff equally seriously and then relating it to computational models. I have no idea exactly what he's going to talk about today, but it will be interesting, I'm sure. And so let's give a warm welcome to Nathaniel Daw.
Thanks. That was a very kind introduction. I think what Reid didn't exactly say was that I arrived in grad school in 1997, having been the sort of first generation of grad students right when Reid and Peter's science paper came out, connecting TD to the dopamine system, which of course has been incredibly seminal. And that was really my thesis, was sort of riffing on that idea. And it was because I came of age at the right time that I could sort of ride that wave that Reid and Peter launched. So anyway, and I'm going to talk today really kind of an update about that same set of ideas that I've been sort of kicking around for now 20 years or 30 years or whatever it is. And the theme, I think I maybe didn't realize in 1997, but what I think these ideas are really about is sort of solving a central problem in decision making, which is let me just get my pointer going here, because last time I was here, the room was like half this size, and there's like all these people over here who I'm going to try to make a pointer for, but I feel like I'm not even in the same room as you. Anyway, I think a central problem about decision making is that you have actions whose consequences play out at long distances. And what these algorithms are really about, and have been kind of famously used for at now at really great success in real AI systems, but are really the same ones at core that we're talking about in the brain, are about bridging those gaps, right? They're about deciding which go move to make, which is going to result in a win or a loss, hours later, or making choices in a maze that are going to get you down to the cheese after many steps. This game is Montezuma's Revenge. So this was a video game. This is the one that when DeepMind trained neural networks to play video games, it was mostly superhuman, where human was measured by the founder's brother, who was played video games in the lab to measure the scores. The one that they couldn't do was Montezuma's Revenge. So, and the reason Montezuma's Revenge is so hard is that this key here opens a door several screens away. And it was just too hard for the computer to learn by trial and error to connect picking up the red key here to making progress many screens down in the game. And so that's a sort of core problem, is how do you make those connections? And this problem comes up in kind of different guises in psychology and neuroscience and computer science. Something's called planning, something's called credit assignment. If you're sort of thinking backwards, like I won the game, where was the move in the past that let me do that? It's called mental simulation. But that's the core problem, is sort of this connecting actions to outcomes over time. And this is really hard in a trial and error circumstance like a rat in a maze. But even if you know how the game works, like if you know the rules of chess or Go, even so, it's hard to figure out those connections, just to compute, right? And an equation that maybe demonstrates this is the objective function that we're trying to sort of optimize when we program computers to do this kind of thing. This is this Q function that Reid talked about. This is saying, what's my expected future value for taking some action, like jumping to the left or right or dropping my Go marble, in some state or situation, like this position on the screen or this position in the game. It's defined as a sum, not just of the reward I get now, but the reward I get in the next time step and the next time step and the next step, all the way to the end of the game. And you can just see from the form of this equation that this is difficult, but this is a sum over future possible states of affairs, like other moves the opponent could have made and so on. And then so there's another one. So there's these nested sums. And so just computing this quantity turns out to be a big problem. Okay. So I've been sort of obsessed with this problem forever. Again, basically, thanks to Reid's work in the 90s. And we've been trying to study in the lab how people and animals do this. So I'm going to just give you a tiny picture of a human experiment, which I'm then going to drop and talk about rats. But just to give you a feel of the kinds of ways we study this. So this is a study in which people do a series of sort of trial and error kind of reinforcement learning game. They've got to choose, they start in one of these three sort of colored rooms, and they have to choose whether to take one path or the other out of that room. And that path is actually, you choose a picture and you see a series of pictures and you get to a treasure chest, and that treasure chest has money in it, or it doesn't, but with some probability. And you have to figure out which treasure chest is better by trial and error. That's sort of constantly changing. And therefore you got to choose which tunnel to take. And the idea is there are three different sets of tunnels that lead to the same two treasure chests. And so there are different strategies people might use to sort of solve this problem. So one of them is just sort of experiential learning about the traverse path. So let's say I chose A and I went through this tunnel and I got money. Then if I came back up here again, lots of sort of simple mechanisms, including the one that sort of Reid famously associated with dopamine in the 90s, can experientially learn that A was a good choice and could make that choice again, right? So experientially learning that I got rewarded for something compared to not getting rewarded is a sort of basic function, and people can do that. So if we just ask, if I'm in blue, I choose A and I get rewarded versus not, how much more likely am I to choose A again if I come back to blue? People choose it more often reliably. I think it's a little trickier is to realize that the feedback I get here at X is also relevant if I'm in green to the choice between E and F, or the choice between C and D if I'm in orange, right? Because they lead to the same place. And so that's not experiential learning. That's not just like tagging the thing in my memory that I just did with the reward. That involves understanding the sort of map of the world or the structure of the game to sort of push information I got down here and derive its consequences for a choice I'm going to make up here, right? And it turns out people can do that too. So if I make the same plot, but where they get the experience from taking A in blue and then choosing E in green, I get basically the same result. So people are able to do that. And the question really is, how do they do that? What's happening in their brain? Are they thinking forward when they're in the green box? Are they thinking backward when they get their reward? Think I could have come here from green. That's sort of what we're going to look at. Now, and the rest of this talk is really about how do they do this? How does the brain push information about rewards distally around the world? So the rest of this paper was about studying activity in the human brain using MEG, but I'm going to switch to a sort of similar experiment in rats now because obviously we have more invasive methods that are more informative. Okay, so let's start. Let's start with rats. So here's a rat doing a sort of similar task. I hope you can see it. I have to make it go though. Okay. So you can see her sort of running. She runs back and forth. This is a sort of maze, so certain paths are blocked. And the rule is she has to choose between every time she's at a corner, there are water feeders, and she has to choose between a new corner. If she visits this feeder, then she can choose one of the other two next, and she has some chance of receiving reward. Those chances of receiving reward change over time, so she has to sort of dynamically track which targets are better by trial and error. And also, we sometimes move the barriers, so she has to relearn the routes and potentially trade off the distance against the reward probabilities kind of dynamically. So it's a sort of dynamic, sort of grid world learning problem for people who are in sort of the computer science side. So this is done in Josh Burke's lab in collaboration with Lauren Frank by a former graduate student called Tim Krause. So we've been working on this for a while, but we have the rats doing this. So the first thing to tell you is that they can do this. So if we look sort of globally across blocks, and I plot, for instance, the chance that they're going to choose A versus B as a chance of the programmed reward probability there, then they tend to choose the higher value one. But they trade that off against the distance. So they're sort of fat, lazy rats. So they really hate to run longer distances. And if you sort of put those two things together in a model, the animals significantly favor more reward, but they also favor shorter distances. But that's just ground truth, right? The animal has to figure this out by trial and error. So another way to look at the data, which is more similar to what I showed you from people, is I can look at sort of local kind of win, stay, lose, shift behavior. So just the same way I showed you, starting from the blue box, do I take, which tunnel do I take? I can say starting from this corner, if I had gone here and got rewarded versus going here and getting non-rewarded, if I'm now back at this corner again, am I more or less likely to choose B versus C? And this is now shown as a difference instead of as a two stay rates. But again, the animals are more likely to sort of win stay than to lose stay, right? So the animals trial by trial are more likely to visit rewarded paths. This is the local path. This is saying they experientially, they're able to choose a trajectory that was rewarded again. And I should say that even this is non-trivial, right? Because this whole path, as you saw, I think this video I showed you was sped up by a factor of 2, but that's like a meter and it takes the animal 30 seconds to traverse or something. And so it's connecting a choice that's sort of made down here somewhere with an outcome that happens somewhat later, right? But it's also the case, just like in people, that if I do the same analysis, but they got rewarded or not rewarded for choosing on this path, are they more likely, if they then come here and they're choosing between this and this, are they more likely to choose this than that as a function of whether they're rewarded or not? And the answer again is yes, they're able to do this information about reward received from this experience, they're able to sort of generalize to a different part of the maze and propagate that information to make decisions kind of elsewhere in space and time. So just like people, rats can do both of those things. Okay. So how do we start to look at how they do this? So the first idea I want to mention is something called the value function. And this is really, that's the equation I showed you on the first slide, and that Reid also mentioned in various ways. The idea is, if I could imagine I have a map of the world, and each sort of square here is a location, and there's a reward here, then if I need to know how to get reward if I'm over here, somehow my laser pointer has become a pen, then I need to sort of think through multiple steps to figure out which directions lead me all the way back to here where the reward is. If I were able to sort of learn a function that for each location, this is called the value function, represents how close I am to reward or how much reward I expect in the near future or something, then I no longer have to look very far ahead to figure out what to do, right? It would suffice just to sort of look, at my neighbors and climb the hill, follow the gradient, right? And so if I knew the value function, then that's sufficient to sort of solve the long-range choice problem. And so that's how all these algorithms work, right? That's how the Go playing software, DeepMind works, and the video game playing software works. They're really trying to learn the value function for each location in the game so they can choose which location they want to visit next. So that's sort of the sufficient thing. And that's what we're going to sort of imagine we suspect that rats are trying to compute, right? How do we do that? One way is experientially. So if I walk a path and it ends in reward, then this whole story that I'm going to come back to that Reid produced in 1997 about prediction errors and dopamine and learning and so on is a circuit for pushing value along the path you experienced, right? It's a circuit for I get rewarded, I learn about the things that I did by dopamine and temporal difference errors and so on. So that's one story about how that works in the brain. And again, that explains part of what rats and humans can do, but not all of it. And we have a sort of, a picture of that that again, as I said, goes back to Reid in the 90s. But the other thing you need is a way of doing this updating more inferentially and non-locally. And one idea, which actually is an idea of Rich Sutton's, this is a quote from Rich Sutton, and Reid mentioned Rich Sutton too, his slogan is that planning is learning from simulated experience. So if I could drive imaginary locations through the world and know when they ended in reward, and if that entrained this same circuit, which involves dopamine and striatal neurons that learn about the value from the dopamine signal and tag that to locations, then I could just treat imagined experience the same way I treat actual experience, and I could learn inferentially as well as experientially. And so that's a sort of theory that's at least a hypothesis for how you'd extend Reid's model-free, so-called model-free learning circuit to do this more sort of inferential learning that we see the rats can do. Yes?
Does this only work for rewards that are operating in the Cartesian system? In other words, you have to have a matrix of locations that have values rather than a matrix of...
No, these ideas, I'm visualizing them in space because they're easy to visualize, but this class of algorithms works for stochastic state processes, Markov decision processes is sort of the general, and then there's a version, what if the state's not observable or something? But the same basic ideas, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so video games are a good example where it's not as simple as a graph of locations, it's screens of video in the game, and these algorithms work. But that's a good point. Spatial examples are useful both for visualizing how these things work, but also they're great for the neuroscience for reasons I'll show you in a bit. So that's why we're working in space. Again, and I swear I didn't make these slides just to come here. Everywhere I go, I give the same talk, and it's all about how important Reid's work was. So I'm happy to be here seeing Reid. But anyway, the sort of classic work identified the firing of dopamine neurons then in the monkey brain with this so-called reward prediction error signal. And in this task, what that looks like, so now we're measuring dopamine in the ventral striatum using a optical indicator called D-light. What you see is when the animal arrives at the port and gets reward, dopamine is positive, and if he doesn't get reward, dopamine is reduced. There's a sort of transient event called a prediction error, or that looks like a prediction error. That is the difference between the reward you expected and the reward you got. So if you're rewarded, that's unexpectedly good. If you're not rewarded, that's unexpectedly bad. It's further modulated by how much you expected the reward. So if this port is, this is just plotted with respect to the objective value of the port again, if the port is good, you'd probably expect a reward there more, and you have a smaller response than if it's bad, then that reward is particularly unexpected. So this is a classic prediction error. This has been shown a billion times in lots of different creatures. And this is the core part of the core idea from Reid's 1996 and 7 papers. A couple things to notice about this. First of all, the broader idea, the rest of that paper, which is about temporal difference learning, is about a strategy for leveraging this signal to learn along paths. And the way, the sort of core mechanism is that this signal transfers backwards along experience paths. And so when I cross from here to here, I might get reward and learn that this square is valuable. And then next time I run down here, I cross from here to here, I get an earlier response and I learn that this square is valuable and so on. And so in that way, I can sort of chain learning backwards. And there's been a bit of controversy in the field for a long time about whether dopamine actually does this and whether animals actually learn that way. And so I think we can show in this task that it is doing that, although that's not by itself sufficient to explain how the animals learn, right? Because they learn much faster. They don't just learn 1x at a time. And they don't just learn along experience paths. One other thing to see about these data, which is pretty interesting, is that, and this may not be completely unrelated to what I just told you, but there's this activity that's been seen a lot in particular neurochemical recordings in rodents and spatial tasks, not just keyed on the rewards, the sort of phasic or transient activity, there's also this sort of ramping activity that's at a lower sort of concentration, but as the animal gets closer to the goal, the reward ramps up, or the dopamine value ramps up. This is seen a lot of times, and there's a lot of controversy about how to interpret it, and I don't actually want to get into that. I'm just going to make use of it. I'm just going to leverage it to sort of measure something. And what I want to say I can measure with it, regardless of what it actually is or where it comes from, these ramps are reliable and they seem to co-vary with the animal's value expectation. So this is now zooming in on that as a function of how far away the animal is from the port and also how good the port is, right? And you see it ramps higher if it's a good port and lower if it's a bad port. So you can think of this as a moment-to-moment readout. This is an average, but you can think of it as a moment-to-moment readout on average of the animal's value expectancy as he approaches the port. Something funny is going on at the very end. You see it dips, and we can discuss why that is, but let's skip that for now. We see this even on signal trials. So for instance, this is the animal running the same path at 2 points in the experiment when the true state value is either low or high at the end, because the reward probability is either low or high at the end. And you see the dopamine, even on a single trial, its kind of ramp tracks this difference pretty well. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, now we can see, first of all, the animal really does have a value function in his brain. So that's perhaps evidence in favor of this view of how the circuit is learning what to do. But also we can study how it changes. So the animal runs along here and gets reward. The next time he runs along here, what happens to all this neural signature value, which we can now read out? And the answer is, it does pretty much what you'd expect. And there's different ways to sort of visualize this, and we fit lots of models to it and so on. But let me just give you the gist, which is that if the animal runs the same path he has to run it, in this case, 3 times in a row. Let's say the first time he's not rewarded, the next time he's rewarded, and the third time we're just reading it out. After he's not rewarded, dopamine along the whole path is lower. And then he's rewarded at the end of that. When he runs it again, the whole ramp, as you can see, is moved up. So there's been an update, it looks like, to the animal's value function along that entire meter or whatever it is. By the time he gets through it the next time, he's expecting more reward. And if you reverse the order of the reward and non-reward, you see it moves downward, right? Or the non-rewarded, the trial ending in after a non-reward compared to the trial ending after a reward is higher, right? I might have said that backwards, but I think you get the point. The other point is, if you choose the trials such that he runs on one path and then you read out on the other, you get the same effect. So it appears that value updates on average, not just when the animal gets here and gets rewarded, value updates not just along this path, but also along paths he didn't take. And again, it looks like it's sort of a global change along the whole thing that happens sometime between when the animal gets reward and when he runs that track again. And this is sort of quantifying that. So this is a neural readout of basically the same thing I said before, which is that the animal, proxied not just by the animal's choice behavior, but also by this dopamine ramp in striatum, the animal is able to update his value expectancy non-locally around the entire maze in response to sort of a single outcome here at the corner, right? So again, we're going to sort of figure out how he does that, but we're sort of getting there slowly. Okay, one more thing, just as an aside, for the aficionados, it's a little bit hard to see in average data like this, but I think you kind of can. This particular idea that animals chain learning by prediction errors backing up from one step to the next, which was the sort of core mechanism in the original dopamine papers, you really can't see that in these data also. And we quantify this more carefully, but just to see it in this plot, this is what's shown here is averages over a series of trials in which the animal gets a non-reward, then a reward, then a series of non-rewards, so that we can see the effect of that reward over a series of paths into the same corner. And what you can see is that there's a bump related to the reward that on subsequent paths moves backwards along the path. So there really is a sort of bump of value or prediction error that's pushing backwards serially as the animal runs along the path. And we can quantify this more carefully, but you can see it in the raw data that this is, if this is the activity on one trial, which is plotted again here, on the next trial, that bump is a little further back. And so it really is the case. We think this is real evidence for this mechanism that was described in these early papers. Again, this is not by itself sufficient to explain the choice behavior, but it is there in the animal's sort of covert value expectancy as we measure it. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so that's the sort of first part of this, and this is the part that's done and published. So we can directly visualize, we think, the kind of animal's instantaneous value expectations over space and see it change from rewards. And we do have evidence of this sort of so-called TD0, this sort of chaining activity of value. It's also the case that value is updated kind of all over the maze at long distance, both all along the path that they came from and all along other paths as well. And the choice behavior also follows that. So the question is, how does that happen? What's happening in the brain to make that happen? So the classic idea is that animals, when they're facing a choice, think forward. So they do sort of mental simulation, like, what if I go left? What if I go right? But there's a lot of evidence from other tasks that actually a lot of stuff is going on in the brain when the animals get rewards that looks like animals thinking about paths they could have come from, and that would be sufficient to connect to sort of pre-compute the value of a path they might make in the future. So we're going to look at that, but that's just sort of a preview. Yes.
I'm sorry, can you go over how did you know that the peak moved versus it's not actually two peaks, the first peak is just rising? So in your middle panel there, it's biphasic.
Yeah, look, it looks like there's a second one here.
Yeah.
This is probably not the best way to, this is more visualization. There's lots of, underlying estimates and stuff and model fits and stuff that I didn't go through. So, but the answer is, it's almost visible in raw data plots of the simplest sort. That's sort of but yes, there are funny things about this. But I think this illustrates that you can almost, and you can decide how much you believe it on the basis of just that. You can almost see it even in just plotted data. Yes.
You might have already mentioned this. Where is the dopamine being recorded from?
In the ventral striatum. So this is D-light. This is at the terminals, right? Okay. But what we're doing, and I'm only going to show you very initial results from this because they're really ongoing, is we're recording simultaneously from the hippocampus at representations of location and syncing them to these events or these recordings in order to try to investigate sort of deliberation and planning. So that's the next part. Okay, so how is it that animals do this, right? So I ran here, I got rewarded. Now I'm over here deciding what to do. How do I know that doing something down here, like sort of turning left, is going to get me to a more valuable place than before? One very suggestive idea that comes from, it's been around for a while, but I think is not very well tested, is that you might be able to see sort of mental simulation in the animal brain in a particular system called the hippocampus. So you probably know that neurons in the hippocampus are tuned for particular locations. That is, when the animal's running around, there are neurons that fire when the animal's in one place and there are other neurons that fire when the animal's in another place, and collectively they sort of tile the physical space. And so if you record 100 of them at once, you can decode from the population activity where the animal thinks he is at each moment. That's what plotted here, and it's just a sort of animation from Pfeiffer and Foster from a sort of classic paper. But what this illustrates is that these neurons also fire in coherent trajectories when the animal's standing still. So this is a case where the animal's standing still, he's here, here's where the reward is, and immediately after this event, the animal's gonna run down this path to the reward. But before he does that, he thinks about it. And this is the decode. This is happening over about 150 milliseconds. It's on a loop, but this is a single event, which is a series of place salts light up very quickly. It's called a sharp wave ripple. Those trace out a path. That path typically starts where the animal is and typically goes where the animal is going to go, although not always. So Pfeiffer and this is all quantified in their paper, right? But Pfeiffer and Foster point out that maybe this activity it could be a substrate for kind of mental simulation with a sort of map of the world, right? So this could be the thing. The animal sits here and thinks about, can I get to the reward, right? And if so, that would be sort of the missing link to sort of solve the problem I've told you about. Let me say this another way, or let's sort of back up into sort of models. So again, I said before, this value function is the key thing, and how do we build it? And really, I think I want to say something slightly more than that, which is if you think about when do I want to sort of access this value non-locally, there's really two things, right? So one is, as I mentioned, if I'm here and I'm running and I'm deciding what to do, it's sufficient, but it is necessary to just look nearby in the value function to figure out where to go next, right? So if I could just look nearby, then I could figure out what to do. But in order to spread value around, either when I'm planning at a longer distance if I haven't learned the value function well yet, or when I get new information, like when I get rewards, I need to do sort of longer distance excursions to update the value function, right, in light of new information. And they're actually, I showed you one of them, there are really two different modes of non-local activity in the hippocampus. One is, and I'll show you this in detail in a second, while the animal is running, the activity is actually kind of oscillating around nearby locations. It's running a bit in front of the animal. So it looks like it's tracking locally, kind of retrieving where to go next. And it oscillates at turn point, at sort of choice points over both options. That's called theta cycling. So that's like it's probably for retrieval. And then there's also these sharp wave ripple events like I showed you, where there's these long distance trajectories that would be appropriate for building the value function. And these happen at long distance. However, they more often than not happen backwards during rewards rather than forwards at planning time. And I'll show you an example of that now. So this is a decode of the, if that is going to start. No, I think I have to somehow, okay. This is the animal running the maze. Green is where he is. This is the decode from his brain of the location in hippocampus. And what you see, again, it's doing this kind of cycling thing. Now he gets here, he gets reward. This was 1/4 speed. Now there's going to be one of these sharp wave ripple events. And it's going to slow down just so you can see it. And the activity is going to shoot backwards along the path he came from. Okay. So you can see just in the raw data, these two types of this, what we think is retrieval and what we think is updating. So here's the next trial or another trial.
It's carrying me forward as I'm doing that. And the sharp wave ripple is to run back along the path.
That's right.
Okay.
So, oh, sorry. Oh, shoot. So I messed it up, but now that was the sharp wave ripple. Now we're going to do, yeah, the jargon is not that important, but the theta is the forward retrieval. And again, I think the forward retrieval is relatively local, right? But is really visible, especially at choice points. And this is an interesting one because he's clearly, you can just anthropomorphize here. He's really thinking about going up there. It goes a little further, and then he decides not to, and he goes down here. Okay, so, and he's gonna get, I'll just show you one more. He's gonna get to the corner, he's gonna get another award, he's gonna get another sharp wave ripple. This sharp wave ripple does not go, one of the things you should know, this sharp wave ripple does not go where he came from. It follows a slightly different path, right? So these sharp wave ripples don't necessarily just rewind where he came from, they could go to other places he could have come from. In other preparations, we know that they're actually rewinding backwards rather than, say, thinking about where he could go next forwards, because the place fields are directional. So there's a difference between the activity you'd see running forward along a path and rewinding backward along it.
Do they ever run wildly different?
Yes, they can be, they can follow total, I mean, here there's a certain amount that has to be shared, right? But they could go anywhere else after that. Yeah, so they can also not even start where you are, right? They're pretty diverse.
So just to clarify, how do you disentangle the fact that the animal is actually building just a spatial representation of the maze independent of the word, so that, you know, any playback could represent a spatial representation independent of the behavioral?
That is, if I make it to the end of my talk, which I doubt I will, that is a deep question.
Yeah.
And we're probably closer in the end to the latter view, with the caveat that you can view the spatial map as a stack of value functions with respect to getting to different goals. So I think a more general view is that that this activity could be updating paths to many different potential goals, and I'll unpack that more carefully later. But that's a direct generalization of the idea I'm saying now. It's actually closer than it sounds, I guess.
So
is
the
what I'm
spatial
saying.
map isn't strictly geometric; it's actually
Telling you how to get from one
Right.
place to another, and if that place becomes valuable, then
right.
it's
Then that's
but it is also true that these events are largely triggered by reward, and that will we think, and this is the part I don't really have finished results to show you. we think that this event is what's mediating the change in the value functions we read out in striatum. And so the real experiment is going to be interrupting it and so on. And, but we're working on that. Looks like Reed was about to ask another question, or maybe thought, okay. So anyway, that's the sort of class of ideas we have. Let me show you one. This is a preliminary analysis that's meant to test whether what I just said, we don't have a lot of data yet where we have dopamine and hippocampus at the same time, and there are other issues, but these are these backward examples of backward trajectories, right? Now I could ask the question, I showed you before that when I run through some particular hex, having received reward, that the value proxied by dopamine in that hex increases. Now my claim is going to be what mediates that increase is if a sharp wave ripple runs backward during the reward, because dopamine is going crazy during the reward as we saw, and it passes through that hex, then that's when the value moves up. And if it doesn't pass through, it doesn't move up or doesn't move up as much. And so all of that comes down to a single statistical test. This is 2 animals in 6 or 7 sessions. And it is significantly the case that if I look at any in each particular hex, and I separate it as a function of the reward, this is on trajectories that led to a rewarded port in the same hex, if it participated in a sharp wave ripple versus not, there's a bigger dopamine response. So a lot more to do, but this is at least initial evidence that for hypothesis that our readout of value is being updated, increased by these events during reward. That's the sort of mechanism we have in mind. Yes.
I have 2 questions. Question 1 is, what is it that David Foster didn't fill in that you think you guys have done? And let me just put the next one. The next one is, so generalization here goes over counterfactual things and over even stuff that I might not even have done because it wasn't local. When you said it went wild, well, I was wondering, is it generalizing on things I might have done because they were within reach?
I see.
Or does it also generalize about this location relative to whatever else you have here? This wild trajectory is going to help me generalize to that.
So I mean, I can tell you what I imagine and not what I know. What I imagine is the density of these events, the chance that, let's say if we just focus on when I get reward, right? The density of these events is going to fall off in space by distance from the reward. And the hope is that that's going to sort of correspond to value, right? That they're going to participate more often and sooner if it's closer, and less often and less soon if they're farther away. And that's going to basically give you the correct estimate. That we haven't proven. But I think the real thing to do is which we can do and are working on, is to intervene causally on these events and interrupt them for certain destinations and so on. That's what we're trying to do. That's one thing. What did we do that Foster didn't do? So Foster famously noted these backwards events, although he switched to paying more attention to forwards events later on. Of course, he hasn't related them in any kind of trial by trial sense to the animal's choice behavior, which is what we're going to be trying to do, or to a neural readout of value, right? So we're trying, I mean, so this is a building block that could propagate value or information about spatial connectivity, which is sufficient to estimate value. We want to connect this, and clearly we're not done, to choice behavior and to other neural measures of value, right? So really close the loop and show that it's for reinforcement learning. It's one thing to just say that it could do that, right? Animals can do that, and there's a signal in their brain that could do that, and we want to close the loop. So that's the answer. Good. So that's as far as this project has gone. How am I doing on time? Okay, so we're still collecting data there, but I think I'm excited that it seems like we've got a handle on something in animals really doing a dynamic learning task where they're constantly having to update their information, figure out what to do. Okay. I thought for the last few minutes I'd switch gears to some theory work, and this really comes back to the question, that came up about the distinction between, or we'll eventually get to the question about the distinction between updating value and updating maps. And this is theoretical work, and it's basically aiming to answer the question, given now that these sharp wave ripple events could light up anything, where should the animal focus on? And maybe this is partly what Reid was asking too. Can we get any leverage from first principles to ask, where would we see these events, right? And so I think if we just come back and sort of step back a minute and say, we see these update patterns, what can we learn from them if they really are the substrate for sort of planning in the brain? There's a few things that are immediately jump out. So one is, these aren't like spheres, right? They're not cones. They're really trajectories, and that's because the hippocampus, I think, is an attractor and it only represents one location at a time. So search is serial. Like if this is really searching possible paths in the world, it has to do them one at a time. And that means because there's lots of paths, at least in bigger tasks, there has to be some priority, right? You can't think about everything. All the more so because as we've seen, this really only happens when the animal's standing still. When the animal's running, it's in this kind of retrieval mode, this theta mode, which is not representing, for the most part, locations that are far away. So there's a sort of opportunity cost to thinking. You could either think or you can run, but you can't do both at the same time, which again means that you've got to have some priority. And then again, I've stressed already, but this was a sort of big confusing puzzle. If you too narrowly construed planning to be, I'm standing here, I need to think about where to go, then that's a sort of minority of these events. Most of these events in many different situations happen backward at reward time. And we can understand that as solving the same problem. I need to make a decision, where can I get? Or I have some new information that I can use to set up myself to make a future decision. I'm going to just pre-propagate that, right? Either way, I'm propagating this reward information over space and time. Those two patterns would accomplish the same thing. But all these together really highlight the question, what the animal should think about when. And what I want to say is, if we take seriously the idea that this is about pushing value around functionally, could we explain why different patterns occur in different circumstances? So there's lots of different experiments where sometimes you see forward replay, sometimes you see backwards replay, sometimes you see other patterns altogether. Maybe we can make sense of all of these by thinking about, when do you want to push value around? And I'm worried that I'm kind of running out of time. This is a 1 hour slot, right? So maybe I'll just give you the gist. The gist is, we can write down, and Marcelo Matar did this in my lab, and this is I think a very beautiful piece of theory that he did. We can write down a function of why would I want to deliberate, right? Why would I want to push information about value around? That's going to have value if it helps me to make better choices and get me to the cheese faster, get me to my goals faster. We can quantify that. Turns out we can quantify it, and I'm not going to unpack this due to time, but we can quantify it in terms of two terms, which we call need and gain. One of them is sort of where I'm going to be, and one of them was like where I'm likely to need to make choices, and one is like where those choices are going to be improved by what I happen to know. The value of deliberation is the product of those two terms. Turns out one of them wants to push replay forwards, and one of them wants to push replay backwards. And so just by building a toy model of these things, it turns out we can we can explain a bunch of sort of regularities from the literature, most of which is not really on reinforcement learning tasks, right? But just of historical papers about the patterns of these sharp wave ripple events as a function of training, or when you give animals shocks or emit rewards or give them rewards they didn't expect, or before they run and after they run. The model can pick up a bunch of this stuff and explain where it comes from. And so the idea is the play cells are firing in this patterns you would expect if this is what they were for. The caveat with that is two challenges, one of which was raised by this gentleman. The theoretical challenge is that a lot of people think that replay in this field is replay really about learning maps and not specifically about value. And our answer to that is that this idea of value actually extends to a map-like idea, which is that if you learn a whole stack of value functions, this is the one for the real goal, but this is a hypothetical one if the goal were over here, and so on. Those collectively are the most useful kind of map of the world. They can be learned by the same kind of replay and so on. And then whenever you have a new goal, you just need to reweight the maps and pay attention to a new one. So we can extend our previous theory to one in which we learn a full suite of value functions for different possible goals and not just one, which is a sort of way of capturing this map learning idea. Why do people think this? The reason I think this is sort of the evidence part of this, there's a bunch of experiments now, or at least a couple, that have shown a sort of decoupling between basically between the animal's current reward expectations and the paths they tend to replay in certain circumstances. But in other circumstances, like the ones in the Pfeiffer and Foster paper I mentioned, there seems to be a tighter coupling. And without going into detail, we have extended this model, and the paper just came out, to cover the learning all the value functions at once, to capture the new data. It reduces to the Pfeiffer and Foster, to the previous model, and to the sort of Pfeiffer and Foster case in certain circumstances where the goals are more stable and the animals understand them. And so we think we have a more general account that explains the relationship between map learning, value function learning, and why you see things that look like one and not the other. And with that, I think I'll wrap up. Just to recap, I've shown you that both behavior and sort of neural readouts of value in the brain suggest that the brain does kind of non-local credit assignment, reflecting knowledge of the sort of map of the world or the connectivity of space or something, which is called model-based. I've argued that hippocampal replay might serve as a window into this process. And we think it's being used both for kind of retrieval while the animal's running and also for sort of updating when the animal finds stuff out. And that leads to this kind of theory, which I skipped over very quickly, which is really thinking about selection and trying to understand why the animal is thinking about certain paths and not others. And then a generalized version of that, where what if replays for updating a whole map and not just a single value function for your current goals. What we're trying to do now, and you can see these experiments unfolding, and this is in part what, in response to what Reid asked, these ideas basically predict a sort of chain of relationships, sort of causally, in animals doing these kind of tasks like the maze running. So we needed tasks where the animals are actually learning stuff and we could quantify that learning in their choices. So we've got that working. Now what the animal does should affect what he needs to replay and where he's learned stuff and where he's most wants to propagate it. That should update value or maps in his head, which we can read out with dopamine and also read out his choices. So we can basically record all these things at once and also manipulate or interrupt at various steps and really try to understand this whole relationship. So that's the sort of picture. And I showed you some early bits of that or building blocks. Maybe one more thing to say, since there's so much interest in computational psychiatry here, there's been a lot of interest in these dopamine circuits and these sort of more kind of model-based versus deliberative versus automatic ideas in the context of psychiatry, just to think that disorders involving compulsion and drug abuse and so on might work by sort of some kind of hijacking of this kind of automatic experiential learning circuit, and dopamine. I think one of the nice things about this set of ideas is that if part of what the brain has to do is control what to think about, is to control which paths, in the case of the spatial experiment, to push value along, then that's going to get something other than the idea that I learn this habit and I do this thing I shouldn't do over and over again because I sort of neglect thinking about the consequences. This is sort of the opposite. It captures, or it could be thought to capture another set of symptoms like worry and rumination and craving and obsession, trauma. Peter Dean has a paper using this model for PTSD, showing how sort of cognitive symptoms of these sorts, which would correspond to sort of content biases in replay, would have behavioral effects in terms of distorted choices and weird evaluations, right? So you get worry leading to avoidance. And so I think this is a useful set of building blocks for thinking about those kinds of things. And with that, I'll wrap up. The rat work was done by Tim with Josh and Lauren. Marcelo and Yotam did the theory, and the human experimentation which a bit of was done with the people in London. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Incredible stuff. The question I'm going to ask probably requires delving into human subject experiments, and perhaps that hasn't been done. And maybe there's some really crafty ways to do it in animals. But anyway, the question is about really the relationship of dopamine to informing decisions and the updates and the, for lack of a better term, feelings of reward of the dopamine signal at a more, I guess, conscious level, another way to think about it. And I'm just wondering, to what degree do we know that relationship, and to what degree is there a linearity even in the dopamine updating signal with increased concentration? I realize that probably also gets into some of the work Rita's doing with measuring actual dopamine levels, but can you comment on that?
So I think, I mean, I guess, I think there's potentially the operational question of how informationally, how do certain experiences affect my choices, let's say, which you can do with rats, is one of the things that's nice about that set of studies, going back to Tolman, is they don't say anything about what the animal is conscious of, right? So it might or might not be the case that the set of things that your hippocampus is doing is cognitively accessible to you, let's say, or your dopamine. I think people often have the idea that dopamine in particular is associated with kind of implicit procedural learning, like knowing how to ride a bike or something that isn't actually cognitively accessible. But even in the hippocampus, I think phenomena that are related to some of the stuff I talked about, like transitive inference and so on, can happen without knowledge. Like people can make these associations but not know why, and it's hippocampal dependent. It's clearly also the case that people can do kind of explicit reasoning that's linguistically scaffolded and so on. They do know about, and is that a different thing? Is it the same thing? I think we don't know enough about the relationship between subjective conscious experience and the operation of these mechanisms, but I don't think they're the same. Like, I don't think it's just that, you know, model-based things are conscious and model-free ones are not, or something.
Hi. So I'm not going to ask you about people. I'm going to ask you about owls.
Oh, no. I know nothing about owls. So.
Well, no, but this is, so most of the work in the rat that you've done is a visual spatial map with coordinates that are defined by reward. But owls, for example, construct this constantly dynamic computational map based on auditory information, some visual information, and motor programs to get reward in particular locations for, you know, prey finding. So in that kind of a computational map where the reward is never stable in terms of its location, but it is referring, how would this model work?
Yeah, so this, I think that, I mean, I didn't get into it, but when rewards move around all the time, in order to switch quickly, you need a generalized value function, right? They're different, and these ideas in computer science, they're called generalized value functions, or they have a bunch of different names, goal condition value functions. But the idea is you just explode this into a stack of value functions, then you can switch goals properly. But you can learn all of them because they all depend on the same physics or the same barriers and layout of the world. A single, you know, dopamine update, or a single trace of a path can update all of them at once. And so there's a certain sense in which you can sort of do all this in parallel, but of the particular goal, and then you can switch goals. And we rely on that in ways I didn't explain to explain a bunch of data on these recent experiments with hippocampus. But it's, yeah, these are cases beyond the ones we're studying, relatively stable tasks in rodents for now. partly because of the looking under the lamppost with the hippocampus, right? But yeah.
Dr. Daw, back here. Sorry, this corner.
I see. Good.
Great talk. On these like subtle dopamine signatures.
Yeah.
So I don't know much about, I've never heard about that signature before. It's very interesting. And so I just wanted to know, do you think, or what do you think about that signature and as it relates to biologically? Is there something that you're exploring there?
I'm not sure I quite, I think this signature really does depend. It's not, what we're seeing here is if you view a spatial map as a set of functions which are proximity to different goals, this is sort of a scalar, which is proximity to the animal's current goal, right? So this isn't a readout of a full spatial map. This is that spatial map projected through the animal's current rewards. But I think you could understand it that way. And I think that's one way to reconcile. You could view it, the animal just has a value function and this is that, or you could view it as the animal has lots of value functions and we're looking at the one that is his current value function, and they're really all being updated. Is that the kind of question that you have?
Yeah.
I think I wouldn't say confidence here in that if this is, well, it depends on what you mean by confidence, right? But this is, I mean, it's confidence in it's how likely are to be rewarded, right? So this is 75%, this is 50%, and this is 25%. The animal's kind of equally uncertain in 75 and 25, but he likes 75 more than 25. So it's a valenced sense of value, if that makes sense.
Hi, great talk. Thank you. I was wondering, as you mentioned that the value function is not only restricted by the case where you're talking about like spatial location, but I'm like trying to wrap around like and imagine like how the brain system would do with the Markovian kind of processes when you have to or want to plan ahead or think about the backward. Would there be a separate brain system that helps like structuring those kind of relationship between the events and hold that information? And if that happens, like for how long, how far, other than hippocampus?
It's a good question. I think we don't necessarily know enough about it. So I think in humans, I mean, I have a whole sort of industry of studying people doing decision making and multi-step tasks, which are MDPs, like probabilistic multi-step tasks involving fractals connected to other fractals or decodable images. And this is one. This doesn't have probabilities, but this is not. I showed it as though it were spatial, but it's actually just a series of images, right, that we can decode. And so there's all kinds of work then in this line trying to do similar things in people, decoding reinstatement or sort of sequential replay of experiences to try to see if people are thinking about paths or thinking about other states of the world in visual cortex, use faces and houses or whatever. We don't think that the model is in visual cortex. We think the associated probably learned in hippocampus, but and sometimes when you do source localization and stuff, you see hippocampus or enteral cortex or something, but we don't know enough about it, right? Yeah, I think that the question of whether hippocampus is special for space or not, or it's, is prefrontal cortex involved in this and so on, we don't know as much, I think it's fair to say.
Eye-opening talk. I can't think too deep, but maybe this question is for you and Reed. We know that rodents, when you put in the cage with a running wheel, they just jump on it and run. And I'm wondering whether dopamine is a kind of not a reward, but a reward action in the brain that make them want to run more and more.
Yes, I think that's a very exciting idea. Reed has worked on that. I think I published a paper with Reed on that when I was in grad school, actually, in some ways. 20 years ago. I think actually in some ways that's another of the central puzzles of dopamine is that it arose in two separate literatures, right? It was about movement and Parkinson's disease, and then also in reward and addiction and so on. And why is the same molecule involved in both those things? And in what way does it couple those functions? I think Reed has thoughts about that. I think these ideas, the sort of TD learning ideas, help to explain that because they're about learning what to do and which things are valuable and so on. Reed may have more to say. We had another paper, Yael Niv did a paper some time ago. I think it's also the case that dopamine has invigorating aspects or functions that are not mediated by learning, that, sort of instant, and there's evidence for this of various sorts. And I think it's anything about why that would be, why it is that the molecule that signals a surprising reward also invigorates ongoing behavior. And our story about that was basically in this previous model some time ago was that in a world where rewards are denser, the opportunity cost of inaction is harsher. And so all else equal, if the world is full of rewards, you should behave more vigorously because you should siphon them up more, and not doing so has a bigger cost. And so that's why you would couple those things together. But that was sort of an idea. Reed may have something to say.
I do have something to say, but it's more like it's amazing the level of conversations we're having about it now, given how fast it's come in 20 years. That's what's amazing to me. Let me, okay, you're going to get the last question. There's two online questions. Oh, it's an anonymous attendee.
That's not okay. Make yourself known.
All right, who are you? Who is the anonymous attendee?
But the answer to that is no. So have you tried turning off VTA during these replays? That's on the list. I think that experiment has actually been done but not analyzed. They're working on that. But
in the second one?
I'm curious whether there are any between rodent differences in use of retrieval versus updating. Did some show more wave versus theta activity? Did that relate to the speed of learning exposure? We have not looked at that. But we're hoping to look within rodent, across time. When is it that they see sharp waves? When they don't see sharp waves, I showed you a little bit of that. When we don't have a sharp wave, does that change the behavior, the learning? When is theta doing this cycling and when isn't it? There's evidence that as the animals get more practice, they stop the theta cycling, and so maybe they're only using it when they're still trying to figure out what to do. These are the kinds of things we're trying to look at. We haven't thought about it in individual differences setting, but that's an interesting one as well. Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to ask about that. Is it possible to separate the planning and also the credit assignment in terms of the replay? Because in the theory paper and in the Marcellus 2018, you show that actually that one framework can explaining whether it's going to be backward or forward replay. But actually that based on what you say that the planning doesn't really require together with the BTA like the dopamine, but actually that if it's a credit assignment, maybe it's supposed to be comes together with this BTA kind of thing. So in this way, in the neuronal level, can you dissociate this possibility? And also my second question is that how this learning is fast, like if the replay is happening, how fastly that the MPFC or the VMPFC can also use these signals in the next trial. Is it that learning is that fast?
I mean, that's the implication. I mean, we'll have to see if the two interruption experiments that we've talked about, if they work, if it were true that turning off the VTA or turning off the sharp waves makes the animals not learn, that would suggest that that's what's going on. But sorry, the other question was, planning versus, so I think that our perspective, I think people who think about planning in the sense that I'm sitting here, I got to think about possible goals and then decide which one to do, think about a chess game or something. you have to keep track. It's probably not good enough just to think of one thing and then do it or not, and do those one at a time. That's one way to do it, but probably you need to keep track of what you found out about. So you can do it if you can entrain striatum and dopamine to the plan, and in particular, if you can drive dopamine with respect to the rewards you encounter in that simulated trajectory, then you can learn, and that using the same, machinery you would use to learn from real experience, you can learn from simulated experience. That's the sort of Sutton, idea. Then that's useful for planning too, right? Because I think people don't pay enough attention to the fact that planning requires remembering, aggregating multiple possible trajectories, typically. And so this is a solution to that as well. Whether it really is how it works, I don't know. But I don't think it's forward and backward or different in that respect necessarily.
Potentially related with the TD lambda too, maybe? If the planning is also associated with how much previous time you want to assign the credit, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one thing I didn't stress, so the experiential learning you could do by TD lambda with a very large lambda. So for the aficionados, maybe I'm going to skip unpacking that for everybody else. But another possibility is that that too is not, that the natural lambda in the brain is short, and that's why we see that backup stuff. But there actually is experiential learning over long distances also mediated by sharp waves. We don't know, and I think we want to sort of ask these questions like, does the sharp wave density and its effects on subsequent dopamine interact with whether it's an experience path or not, and so on, and does blocking it matter, and so on. Yeah, that's right.
It went long, but thanks for everything.